Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us for this exciting second edition of a respectful and civil dialogue from varying points of view. It's part of who we are at the University of Findlay. As you well know, those of you who know us well, one of our principles that guide our work here is that we're founded in Christian faith and welcome all people. Another is that we deliberate respectfully and welcome a variety of opinions on important matters. And we try to demonstrate for our students, and we learn from our students, how to do that in civil discourse. And this evening is will be a beautiful example of just that. We have with us this evening Dr. Robert DiSilvestro from The Ohio State University, representing a Christian point of view on our topic. And we have Dr. Ivana Nikolic Hughes from Columbia, representing an atheist point of view on our topic. And moderating the conversation will be our own Dr. Brent Sleasman, president of Winebrenner Theological Seminary. So please join me in welcoming our guest.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much to the organizers for the invitation to come and speak with all of you tonight. I'm excited to be here. I am, as a scientist, do I go forward for my slide? Yes, I go forward for my slide. There we go. I am, as a scientist, incredibly excited about the picture that science has, over really the last few hundred years, painted for us about the world that we live in, the natural world that we're a part of, and how it is that we've actually come to be here. And I have compared, this is a fairly complex picture, I have compared it in the past to pieces of a puzzle being laid down over a long period of time by scientists from various fields, trying to figure out and put it all together, what that picture, that journey that brings us here today actually is. And it's a puzzle that's not yet complete. It still has some missing pieces, but the overall picture is pretty clear. I don't have time to really talk about all parts of it. What I want to focus on tonight is this question of the origins of the universe, as that is the topic of our discussion. And I'm going to begin our story by telling you a little bit about Edwin Hubble. Edwin Hubble was an American astronomer. He was born in Missouri and grew up and was schooled in Chicago. Edwin Hubble was some people would refer to him as almost superhuman. He was handsome, he was athletic, he had won a state record for Illinois in the high jump. He loved science and loved school, attended University of Chicago, and went on to study at Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar. And he studied law at the urging of his father. Came back to Illinois and practiced law for just a little bit before going back to the university to study astronomy, which was really his love and his passion. And after getting his PhD, Hubble was really very fortunate. He ended up getting a position at a place called the Mount Wilson Observatory, which at the time had the world's largest telescope. And in many ways, this was just after World War I, and in many ways, Hubble ended up being at the right place at the right time. Just around that time, other astronomers in the country, including Henrietta Leavitt, who was at Harvard, and Vesta Slifer, who was in Arizona, were figuring out different ways of studying objects in the universe. And Henrietta Leavitt in particular focused on how we could determine distances to objects very far away, but determine how exactly far away they are. And Vesta Slifer was working on figuring out how these objects were moving with respect to us. Were they moving towards us? Were they moving away from us? And if so, at what speeds? And so Hubble, with having this amazing, incredible telescope, really began to study some of these objects and use some of these methods. And one of the first things that he did, and this is actually a picture from Hubble from 1923, is he pointed the telescope at what was known to be a blob of light, and it was just not clear where this thing was, and sort of it was clear that it was consisting of many stars, but really where it was. And by that time, astronomers knew that our own sort of neighborhood, the stars that were around us consisted and made up what we today call the Milky Way galaxy, and they sort of knew what the size of the galaxy was. And so when Hubble pointed his telescope at this blob of light, he actually realized that he had just discovered a new galaxy. It was really, really far away, much farther away than the Milky Way itself. And so this told us for the first time that this, call it universe, was actually much bigger than what we had thought previously. And so Hubble went on to study other blobs of light. This is actually just, I wanted to show you a picture of this new galaxy. We call it Andromeda today. This is a picture so you can compare what Hubble saw. You can tell that our telescopes have gotten a lot better. Andromeda is, interestingly, it's about 2.5 million light years away from us. And if I told you the number in miles, I wouldn't even know how to describe it. It's 1 followed by 19 zeros in terms of miles. So that's really, really far away. And 2.5 million light years away means that it takes light 2.5 million years to travel to us. So what that means is that when we see Andromeda, so for example, this picture right here, that's a picture of Andromeda as it was 2.5 million years ago. Because the only way, that's the light that we've received, so we see it as it was 2.5 million years ago. And if there were some sufficiently intelligent civilization somewhere inside Andromeda. Andromeda has about 300 billion stars in it. If they were looking out, if they had these amazing telescopes that could see all the way to the Earth, they would not see us today. They would see the Earth as it was 2.5 million years ago. So they would see something like the species Australopithecus afarensis, which is one of our human ancestor species. There are fossils in the American Museum of Natural History of Lucy. It's a fairly famous old fossil. But after this, Hubble went on to look at other blobs of light. They called them nebulae at the time. We now know these are all galaxies. And he made the two measurements that I told you about. How far away are these blobs of light from us, and how fast are they moving either towards us or away from us? And what he found was that most of them were moving away from us, and they were doing so faster the farther away that they were. And so this was, you might be a little bit unconvinced by his data, and I wouldn't blame you because there's a lot of scatter, but I'll show you a more recent graph where that relationship is much more apparent. The reason this is a cleaner graph is, sure, Hubble had some errors, but it's also that the modern astronomers can look much farther in the universe and so see this linear relationship much more clearly. And what this linear relationship is telling us, and this is also consistent with what Einstein had figured out in terms of the theory of general relativity, what this data are really telling us, so what does this mean? It's telling us that the universe is expanding, that space itself is stretching, and these galaxies that are far away from us are moving away farther as the universe continues to expand. And so At the time, many people said, well, what does this really mean? This means that there was a beginning to the universe, that there was a Big Bang. And the way you can think about that is if the space itself is stretching, if everything is getting away from us faster the farther away it is, then everything in the universe is really changing, then everything must have been much closer together in the past, and you could actually get to a moment in the past where everything was completely together in one point in space and time, and that's where it all started from. So you sort of need to rewind the clock to get to the Big Bang. And even at that time, many scientists accepted that this is what these data were telling us, including Einstein in 1931, but others didn't, until we actually got something else in 1964, where two astronomers at Bell Labs in New Jersey actually discovered that the universe, everywhere we looked, is filled with this light, with this leftover radiation from the Big Bang that is, if you imagine the Big Bang being very, very, very hot, and then the universe expands from there, then you can imagine that whatever light or radiation was left over from that would have expanded along with the expansion of space. In fact, the wavelengths of light would get longer, and so that's what we see in the cosmic microwave background. This picture here is not meant to say that the light in the universe is blue and red. That's just meant to show you that there were differences. They were really, really tiny, but there were enough differences in that original light to allow for formation of what we would now call cosmic voids and formation of galaxies. So the picture that we have, the final picture we have, is we started the Big Bang and we move forward towards the present. It's about 13.8 billion years since the Big Bang happened. And immediately after the Big Bang is this period of inflation where the universe sort of grows to an astronomical size and then continues to expand. So it turns out that Hubble didn't win the Nobel Prize for his discovery. Many people would say that this is the most important discovery since Copernicus said that the sun was, that the Earth was not the center of the solar system, that the sun was. He didn't win it not because people didn't think it wasn't an important contribution. It was at the time the Nobel Prize for Physics was not given out for astronomical discoveries, and even though Hubble lobbied the committee to actually give out Nobel Prizes for astronomy, they didn't agree to it, and he passed on before they actually did change the rules. And nowadays, every so often, you'll hear about people winning a Nobel Prize for contributions to astronomy or astrophysics. But I think Hubble got something better. Anyone knows what this is? Anyone? Hubble Space Telescope, that's right. So the Hubble Space, I think he got a better deal than the Nobel Prize. So the Hubble Space Telescope was launched in 1990. It's been in operation for almost 30 years. And it's a telescope that we've used to learn so much about the universe. It's really quite incredible. I'm going to show you 3 of my favorite images. Anyone knows what this one is called? It's called the Pillars of Creation. It's what we're looking at is gas and dust forming new stars. This one, any guesses? What does it look like? Butterfly, it's a butterfly nebula. Yes, astronomers come up with names, and this one is one of my absolute favorites. So what happens is actually, just as I said, that space itself stretches, we know also that massive objects, massive objects curve space-time around them, and so what you're looking at is bending of light due to these two massive galaxies. And this is a real effect. This is not just someone drew this, for fun. This is a real effect of gravitational lensing. And so I love the universe is smiling on us. But one of the things that Hubble Space Telescope did in 2003 and 2004, scientists were interested in figuring out what would happen if we point the telescope towards a really, really dark patch of the sky, away from our own galaxy, and stare at it for a really long time. Basically, what they wanted to do is take the best photo of the universe that you could take. And what they did is they pointed not at the moon. I'm showing you the moon just so you can understand the size of the patch of the sky they were looking at. The size was equal to this. So if you were looking at the moon and you know what it looks like to you, if you were pointing a telescope to a tiny, tiny piece, much smaller than the moon, that's what they did. And this is what they found. This is the image. It's known as the Hubble Ultra Deep Field. The image basically has just about 10,000 objects in it. A couple of them are stars in our own galaxy. They couldn't avoid them. But the other, just about 10,000 of them are actual galaxies. And so because they were looking at a tiny patch of the sky, and because when we look, different parts of the sky seem to be the same everywhere, from this image we can conclude that the universe has on the order of 100 billion galaxies. That's really just absolutely incredible. So I want to finish. The organizers asked me to address the question, what was there before the Big Bang? And there are really sort of two ways that I could answer this. One is to say nothing. The Big Bang created energy and matter. It created space and time. There was no space and there was no time before the Big Bang. So I can just say the answer is nothing. The second answer is that this is really one of those missing pieces from the puzzle I mentioned in the beginning. We still don't know. Scientists are still working on it. There are scientists who work on theories trying to understand whether the Big Bang happens, the universe expands, then it contracts, then it starts up again. That would be something like a cyclical universe. There are scientists who propose that actually we're part of a multiverse and our universe is just one of many. When and where, when and how are we going to figure this out? I don't know yet. But I am so deeply, I think, inspired by all the things we have been able to figure out so far that I also think we'll find some of these answers in the future as well. So thank you again for having me, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
There we go. Okay, the Bible portrays God as a creator, a designer, a prime mover. I believe the scientific evidence to say that such a God actually exists. I'm going to go through just 5 examples of origins that I believe saying God is responsible for these 5 origins is a reasonable hypothesis. So I will start with the origin of the universe. According to Dr. Hughes and according to a popular TV show, it started with a Big Bang. The universe had a beginning. Now, maybe you're sitting out there and asking 3 things about the Big Bang. There are 3 things that I think the average person would often ask. Boy, this thing's jumpy. Okay, there. What started it? Where did the matter come from? And how did we get the incredible precision? The Big Bang had to fall out with mind-boggling precision in order to get to what we have today. You couldn't have just any old Big Bang. You had to have one that happened like it happened. There's a scientist named Fred Hoyle who made the comment, nothing has challenged his doubts about God like the precision at which the Big Bang fell out. He said it fell out with such incredible precision. You couldn't say this just happened randomly. However, he still didn't believe in God at the time, but he even acknowledged that it's amazing the precision with which the universe fell out at the Big Bang. So what is a possible answer to what started it? Where did the matter come from? How did we get the incredible precision? I would submit to you that saying God did it is not a ridiculous proposition. We somewhat intuitively know we don't get something from nothing. So I think it's perfectly reasonable to say a God that existed outside of time, space, and matter began the Big Bang. I've got some good company on that opinion. Albert Einstein, who as far as we know did not follow any traditional religion, even he said he thinks there had to be some kind of a God. If there was a beginning to the universe, there had to be a beginner. What kind of God? The God, sorry, this thing really jumps around. I'm sorry about that. Okay, the God we have in the Bible, that is a designer and a creator and exists outside the realm of time, space, and matter. The Bible is the only ancient book, holy book, that talks about this kind of a God. So, for example, there is a line in the Bible that talks about, by faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's commands. So what is seen was not made out of what is visible. So I will postulate saying God did it is a perfectly reasonable explanation. Now, can I disprove the multiverse idea? No, but you can't prove it either because we have no way of knowing if there are other universes out there. There could be an infinite number out there, and we happen to be in the one that just happened to fall out just right. However, that does not answer the question of what started it or where did the material come from. And there have been some other explanations, but I would say it's at least as reasonable to believe in a supernatural God that did it as there are billions of multiverses and we just happen to be in the right one. Second thing is origin of order in the universe. There's something called the anthropic principle. It says that the constraints of physics and the properties of astronomy have to be just what they are, or there would be no life on Earth. For example, if something called the strong nuclear force was just 0.5% weaker, we'd have no hydrogen, no water, and no life as we know it. If that strong nuclear force was just 2% stronger, we'd have no protons, we'd have nothing but hydrogen, and you really can't make life out of nothing but hydrogen. Also, properties of the universe in terms of positions of the stars, the planets, the mass of the universe, and many other factors have to be just right so we can have life on this little speck of the universe that we call Earth. So what is an explanation for the origin of this kind of precision? Well, there was an article in the journal Nature that talked like, well, maybe there is some natural explanation for this besides we're just lucky. But even that article in Nature conceded that the simplest explanation is that there's a superintelligence we call God. Again, the God of the Bible is the right kind of God. He is a designer. He's careful. For example, in the book of Psalms, it says he determines the number of the stars and calls them each by name. Calling them by name in that literary genre means he's assigning a special importance to them. So he didn't just, according to the Bible, he didn't just say, let's see, have this many stars today. Just put them any old place. It says that he actually numbered them and assigned special importance to each one. Now, once again, I can't prove that God is responsible for the anthropic principle, but the journal Nature and I both say that is a reasonable explanation. So either way, there's going to be a little bit of faith required. With the Big Bang, you could put the faith in science that they'll eventually figure this out, although there are some scientific arguments that will say, no, we won't figure it out. This is it. It can't happen by natural means. Or you could put faith that, well, there's some explanation why all this happened to be just so, and I can't say you're absolutely wrong. But I'd say that a belief in God, and especially the God of the Bible, is at least as reasonable an explanation as these others. And again, eventually it comes down to faith. And I'm hoping, I don't know if I'll get to it in this section, but I'm hoping sometime before the end of the program I can talk a little bit about how faith and science interact in my life. Third origin, the origin of life. Now, I give whole talks on this, so I don't have time to go into all the issues as to why I believe God started life versus purely natural processes. Instead, I want to just tell you about what some other people say. There's a chemist named Robert Shapiro. He spoke at a recent conference on origin of life. And he basically said, I am just really frustrated. I just don't know how we're going to find any kind of natural explanation for the origin of life. And during the question and answer time, absolutely nobody challenged him on his reasoning for why he just didn't think natural explanations were going to cut it. And finally, the moderator just said to him, do you have to be so pessimistic? And he said, yes. Now, despite this, there are scientists that will tell you, no, we're real close. For example, we've seen self-replication in the laboratory without life. We can get molecules to replicate, and we can make simple cell membranes without the need for cells already being formed. That's how life started. Well, I respectfully disagree that the level of sophistication of what they're calling self-replication and what they're calling cell membranes, there's just no comparison. To me, it's like comparing some papers blowing in the wind and saying that's flight, and then looking at a jet passenger plane there and saying, well, they both fly. I don't think there's any comparison between the two. There's also a scientist named Anthony Flew. He used to participate in discussions like this, and he would talk for the atheist side. But late in life, he did an about-face, and he wrote a book called There Is No Crossed Out, a God. And he became convinced there really had to be a God based on science. And one of the things that convinced him was the origin of life. He said, if you look at DNA, the unbelievable complexity of the arrangements that are needed to produce life, an intelligence must have been involved. Another person that believes intelligence is behind the origin of life is Francis Crick. He is part of the Nobel Prize-winning team that discovered the double helix structure of DNA. And he's basically said, I've looked and looked at life on Earth, and it just couldn't happen by natural means. Now, he doesn't say God is the intelligence behind it. He basically says, well, there must have been some intelligent life in outer space, and they saw Earth would be a good place to start more life, and they sent some simple forms of life here, and somehow it got here from who knows how far away, and the life was preserved, and it got here and evolved into everything we see now in the way of life. Okay? Now, he realizes that's just moving all the problems to another planet. If life can start naturally here, why could it start out there? And he just said, I just have to believe somewhere in the universe something is different. That's a faith statement, a blind faith statement. So I would submit which is easier to believe in, his story about the rocket ship or a God. I would say that it's easier to believe in a God. Now, this is not a God of the gaps. That's something I hear all the time when I talk about science and God. Well, you just don't know what's going to happen. When we discover more, we'll figure it out. So once upon a time when people couldn't figure out why something happened, they just said God did it. So why did it rain today? Well, God turned on the faucets up in the sky. So it's God of the gaps. When you couldn't figure something out, you just put God in it. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about here having a lot of knowledge. And that knowledge says there's evidence that there was actually intelligent creation behind the Big Bang, behind the anthropic principle, behind the origin of life. Now, do we know everything? No, but as Robert Shapiro said, he's not seeing it. As Crick said, he's not seeing it, but maybe it's different somewhere else. So a lot of people just say, well, we'll figure it out. Well, that's kind of what I call the science of the gaps. That's a faith statement that as we get more information from science, it will support the position that we don't need God. But that's not always been the case. There's been a number of scientific discoveries in the last 30, 40 years that have pointed more toward toward design and away from some of the naturalistic explanations. So we're not talking about a God of the gaps or a science of the gaps. Now, could something be discovered that completely turns things upside down? Yes, it could. So again, there's some faith required. I think saying God did it based on current evidence is as reasonable, if not more so, than naturalistic explanations. But I can't absolutely prove my point is true. What about origin of species? This is another whole talk, and really another whole 4 talks. I'm just going to talk about one aspect. Darwin said that the way we got macroevolution, not microevolution or changes within species, but macroevolution, forming all the new species, the way that happened was a combination of mutations and natural selection. That's how it worked. Well, it may surprise you to know not everyone buys that. And the people not buying it are not necessarily people that are saying God did it. Many years ago, there was a meeting at the Wistar Institute in Pennsylvania, and a group of mathematicians told a group of biologists, it doesn't work. The probability statistics do not work. I love statistics. I didn't have a single stat course in either of my degrees in biochemistry, but when I started publishing in pharmacology journals and I got the reviewers saying, your stats are terrible, I learned stats. So I really like statistics and probabilities. And these mathematicians just told the biologist, it does not work. You can't get new species this way. It doesn't work because as you pile these things up, the chances of it falling apart dwarf the chances of getting to the end and changing species. So the biologist basically said, don't confuse us with the facts, we know it works. Well, there was a meeting within the last couple of years of something called the Royal Society where this was revisited, and basically what was found was that there were people still saying Darwin works, and there were other people saying it does not. The model is broken. You need a better model. Now, they were not saying God did it. They were saying we need a better model like this one or this one. And so they said, the Darwin way doesn't work. So they said, well, your way is just a bunch of ideas. You don't have any data. So they both said the other side was wrong. Now, to the outside world, they say, oh, we're just arguing about minor details. But that's not minor details. That is actually the whole center of evolution that they're arguing about. Now, if I get a chance during the discussion time, I don't have time now, if someone wants to ask me a question, I'll sort of prime the pump here. I'll give you 3 really easy to understand arguments that I make for why I think a creator made the species and not just random undirected processes. Some people that are Christians say this is fine, that they don't care about this issue. You can still believe in God of the Bible, still have evolution of species. I'm not among them because, again, God is portrayed in the Bible as a creator or designer. For instance, in the book of Job, it says that he designed the predator. It says that he created species after their own kind. It doesn't present God as someone that, as Einstein would say, he doesn't play dice with the universe. Okay, one last one, and again, I could talk about more than 5, but I'm just going to do 5. One last one. I'm going to shift from natural science to marketing science. I now have 3 startup companies. I have learned about business and marketing. I've learned mostly how frustrating it is, but I'm learning about business and marketing. The origin of the early church. There is absolutely no good reason the early church spread. Now, some people might think, yeah, but we've seen all kinds of movements spread. None of them spread like the early church did. They had no money, no military might, no political or power advantage, no powerful endorsement backing. They were persecuted, but not separatist. Contrast that with some other movements that were persecuted, but did separate and got an army together. Christians didn't do that. They were persecuted and yet stayed in that society. And they insisted on selling a physical impossibility. Couldn't you just tone this down and make it some nice book of ethics? No, they claimed that Jesus rose from the dead. Try to convince people of that. So, in my opinion, having done some marketing now, there's no good reason to explain the origin of the early church besides the idea that God did it. So just to summarize, I believe the origin of the universe, the origin of the anthropic principle idea of order, the origin of life, the origin of species, and the origin of the church, that saying God did it is at least as reasonable as the other explanations. So I guess I will have a second here or two to talk about faith. Now, none of these are absolute proofs. However, to take the opposing position, none of those are absolute proofs either. So faith does play a role. Now, most people, when they think of faith, tend to think of blind faith. I have no reason to believe it, so I'm going to believe it anyway. Or maybe just some kind of a little bit of a good feeling. Let me tell you a little bit about how faith works with me. I have a professional colleague. Her name is Stacy Bell. And I tell her a lot of my business ideas. I don't want anyone else to know these ideas. I don't want them to get out. When I tell Stacy, I know she won't repeat them. How do I know that? I can't put a diagram up. I can't go in the laboratory and prove it. But I have faith in Stacy that she will not blab what I'm saying. It's something I know, but yet it doesn't fall into the category of a natural science proof. Now, I never met Jesus in quite the same way as I met Stacy. But I read through the Gospels and saw the evidence that what Jesus is said to have said in the Gospels is probably what he actually did say. And I saw what Jesus was like, and I had that same reaction that I had to Stacy. For reasons I can't exactly depict in a natural scientific way, I had faith in Jesus as well. I really believed the things that he taught in the Bible were true, and he was someone that I wanted to trust in. So I thank you for your attention, and hopefully we can have some discussion on these matters.
So I think the way this works is I get to respond to your remarks. So I'm going to go through the 5 points you brought up. The first being that the universe has a beginning, and we're clearly not going to dispute that. I think I'm going to go back to my puzzle example. So we have this picture that has emerged over a long period of time, and that is incredibly consistent, again, between information data from different areas of science on completely different things. Here we're talking about, I was talking earlier about the evidence for how old the universe is, so 13.8 billion years. After that, we know from completely different types of experiments and different kinds of scientists that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. We then know that the oldest forms of life that we see in the fossil record, they're called stromatolites. They're actually quite advanced for their microbial communities at around 3.8 billion years. And so this, and the picture continues on and on. We then have the Cambrian explosion, the explosion in the fossil record of plant and animal life at about 500 million years. And then mass extinctions that happened at 5 mass extinctions that happened since that time, including one at about 250 million years ago that wiped out most of life on the planet, and then another one 65 million years ago that wiped out the dinosaurs. For that one, we have actually really, really good evidence that happened, that extinction happened due to an asteroid impact, a completely random event. There are asteroids in the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter, and they can hit the Earth. In fact, I showed a picture of the moon where you can see a lot of craters. The moon sort of preserves this evidence of impacts from its history, and the Earth doesn't, because it's an active, we have the tectonic processes that would make that preservation difficult. But 65 million years ago, an asteroid hit the Earth, and the dinosaurs that we often think of, T-Rexes and Triceratopses and so on, went extinct. If they hadn't, mammals would wouldn't have evolved. And so over that period, since that extinction, mammals, which at the time were sort of, cousins of squirrels and rats, over 65 million years evolved to a point where 6 to 7 million years ago, our lineage split from the chimps, and then we had evolution going forward as well. So this is a very complex picture. As I said, some pieces are missing, but data from all of these different sciences point to the same thing. To take the beginning of the universe and say, oh yes, the Bible has this right, I think is a bit misleading. So on your second point on the anthropic principle, we know that we live on the Earth because we're just the right distance from the sun for the temperature to be hospitable to life, for the temperature to be just right for liquid water. Oh, thank you. So I'm just going to get to address this one. Maybe we can come back to the other three. And so we know this about the Earth, but we also know just from studying our own galaxy and other stars in our own galaxy that there are other planets out there that might be hospitable to life. And when I was born, we didn't even know whether the sun was the only star with planets around it. We now have evidence of other planets around other stars in the thousands, and we continue to explore. So I think saying that this somehow is special and was sort of put here on purpose, I think that's taking the science to where the evidence isn't. So.
Okay. There's a lot of scientists that say we are a privileged planet, even including some that don't have any particular theological axe to grind, and they've somewhat said, let's not mess this up because I don't know that there's anywhere else it'll work. And if there is anywhere else, it would have to be as unique as we are here. Interesting about and as far as things like the asteroid hitting the Earth and dinosaurs and all that, I don't have any problem with any of that. I think that God can work through natural means. I don't see that as for or against anything I'm saying. I'm kind of neutral toward that. But it was interesting the Cambrian explosion was mentioned. I'm not a paleontologist. I don't pretend to know much about fossils. But again, I think it's interesting what some other people say. There was a meeting a number of years ago where a paleontologist from China talked about the Cambrian explosion and basically said, they were not the first fossils by any means or the oldest, but he was saying the amazing amount of differentiation that was present at the time really, really makes for some real problems for Darwin's concepts. And so at the end of the talk, he's going, all right, I'm going to really get it now. Let's see what the American scientists have to say. None of them challenged any of his big implications. They all asked very small little technical questions about some of the paleontology. And at the end of the talk, he said, I now know the difference between China and the United States. In China, we can criticize Darwin, but we can't criticize the government. In the United States, you can criticize the government, but you can't criticize Darwin. So I thought that was kind of an interesting commentary. Let's see. What else can I talk about that you said? I think a lot of the things that were said were extremely interesting. And again, I don't think they necessarily contradict the idea there could be a God. So I go back to my statement that I think positing that God was responsible for many of these origins is at least as reasonable an explanation as anything else. I've tried to understand Stephen Hawking's explanations for the origin of the universe, and if you could follow them, then I give you credit, but it's a lot of mathematics that's beyond me. But again, it's interesting, two things. One, there's a professor from Oxford that is a mathematician that could follow his arguments, and he basically said, nonsense is nonsense even when it comes from a world-renowned scientist. Also, I think Hawking does say that basically the Big Bang goes back, and before that, there's no time. Well, I would actually agree with that, but I would say that that's true from a natural perspective, but from a supernatural perspective, I don't think there's anything wrong with believing that there was a God that exists outside of space and time that could be responsible. And again, as I finished up my talk and talked about faith, I think in some ways that's almost as convincing to me personally as any of the scientific ideas. Again, it's not something that's scientifically testable. We can scientifically test, is it likely that Jesus said what the Bible says he said? I think the evidence there is very strong. But in terms of having faith in Jesus, it's not something you can entirely do from a test tube. But in my life, I feel like science says my belief is at least reasonable. And then my faith says that it's something that I'm staking my life on. And then in subsequent to my decision for faith, God has done some subjective things in my life that wouldn't convince anybody else I made the right decision. But I feel like I made the right decision from these subjective experiences. And I just say to you, if you say, well, I don't do anything by faith, really? Did you decide on a place to go to college? Did you decide on who your friends are, somebody to marry? You make lots of decisions that are based partly on faith. And so I think in the realm of God, you have to at least have some aspect of faith that remains. So I'll stop there. We'll open it up to other questions or comments.
Dr. Hughes, Dr. DiSilvestro, thank you very much for providing a framework for a range of issues. And in a few moments, we're going to take some time to moderate conversation between them, but be thinking, and we'll speak more about this, we're going to have time to open up for questions from the audience as well. So you can be thinking about what you want to bring. And so I want to raise some issues that you can share some back and forth. If you want to track us time-wise, 20 minutes for this session totally. I'll keep us on track as we go forward. But thank you for presenting a range of issues that cover a variety of perspectives. How do you think, and Dr. Hughes, we'll start with you, and then Dr. DiSilvestro, if you want to respond as well. How do you think your view is most commonly misunderstood by the opposition?
So I think the atheist worldview is most commonly misunderstood on issues that really don't touch on things I've been talking about. So I've been talking about the origins of the universe and the picture that has emerged. I think someone who said, there's a sort of funny story of a woman who's comedian and who somehow, was raised in a religious family and at some point came out as an atheist, and it sort of came out as an atheist. It sort of became news, and her mother called her very upset and said, well, I could understand if you said you didn't believe in God, but to be an atheist, so it's sort of it's meant as a joke that somehow I think there is a connotation, perhaps in this country more than elsewhere, but that there's something almost wrong or immoral with a person who's an atheist. I think it's absolutely fascinating that not a single member of Congress in our country, so not a single person in the House of Representatives or Senate is an atheist or admits to being an atheist. That despite numbers on surveys ranging from 10 to 30%, depending on how you ask these questions. And so I'm going to guess that some of them might actually be much closer to my worldview, but just not admitting it. And I think that is wrong. And it's partly, really for me, the motivation for why I accepted an invitation like this. It's just more for people to get to know someone who is an atheist and where they come from, and that really, I promise, I'm a really nice person. I have a family, I have 3 children, I'm not walking around going, there's no God, so I'm just gonna be moral and do whatever I want. That's of course not. And I think that's a misperception that somehow if you're not religious, there must be something that's missing there. And I do, in many ways, find an incredible amount of inspiration and love and meaning for what I feel science tells me about the natural world. Really just an admiration for what we as a species have accomplished in terms of knowledge, and at the same time, how fortunate we all are to live on this beautiful planet, and that we should embrace more cooperation and love than the alternatives.
Dr. DiSilvestro.
Well, I talked to her before the meeting. I thought she was really nice. I think in my case it would be this idea that science can't say anything about whether there could be a supernatural being. For instance, that article I put up earlier, or at least the reference I put up out of Nature, that said that the simplest explanation for the anthropic principle was the idea that a supernatural intelligence we called God set it up that way. Right after that statement it said, but that's outside the realm of science. And I remember a number of years ago having a little bit of a debate on an NPR station in Virginia with someone named Jeannie Scott, who were talking about evolution issues, what should be taught, and I was basically saying, no, I'm not for teaching the Bible in public schools as the explanation, but I think you could at least point out there's some problems with some of the current theories. And we had this talk, and she said, well, even if that's true, even if all the evidence was against natural explanations for evolution, even if there was all this evidence for God, we still can't accept that because science isn't allowed to. And I was like shocked. So why is it that science can't look for clues that there is an outside designer? I don't think that's off limits. For example, we have forensic science. The goal of forensic science is to distinguish between something that happened without any intelligent input versus something that happened by design. I mean, that's a science, and it makes that differentiation. Or we've got tax money going into studies that are looking for signs of intelligence in outer space. I'm kind of with the person that said he thought that was a waste of money, because he said, why spend all these millions of dollars looking for intelligence in outer space when it's so hard to find it in Washington, D.C.? So I'm kind of with him on that. But nonetheless, the idea is that they're looking for signs of intelligence beyond our immediate realm. So they consider that as something that's scientifically possible to at least look for data. So I think from my perspective, it's not as much philosophical as much scientific, that I feel that we shouldn't simply say science can't say anything about the possibility of a creator or anything religious.
One of the things that I find fascinating along with that is that despite the many differences you would have, both of you raised and touched upon the Big Bang. And both of you, I heard, and so just for clarification, depending on someone's perspective, whether from an atheist, a Christian, or another faith perspective, that I heard you both sympathetic to the idea that the Big Bang could be a plausible explanation for the origin of the universe. And so, Dr. DiSilvestro, from a Christian perspective, that may be a different way of thinking, because many oftentimes frame this as fundamentally Big Bang and a Christian perspective are inconsistent. And then Dr. Hughes, that same type of question, do you see Big Bang then working toward invalidating a Christian worldview and thinking, but I hear some commonality, so could you flesh that out a little bit? Dr. DiSilvestro, we'll start with you, and then Dr. Hughes as well.
Yeah, I think it's perfectly consistent. As I said, I can't absolutely prove that God did it, but I think, as Einstein said, and he was a pretty smart guy, I think there's good reasons to say that's how it worked. But again, I can't rule out something like the multiverses, but then again, it's really hard to rule that in either, because we can't have any real direct knowledge of universes beyond our own. At least that's what I'm told. I'm a biochemist. I don't really deal with that kind of thing, but that's what they tell me.
So I'm going to respond. I'm going to go back to something that both of us said during our opening remarks in regards to the Big Bang. I said that when Hubble first came out with his data, not everyone accepted that this meant, not all the scientists, and that includes Fred Hoyle, whom you mentioned, who sort of I'm going to use the words believed, although that's really not the right term, believed in a static universe, a universe that had been around forever and would continue to be around forever, and was bothered by the changing universe and a universe with a beginning because it sounded too much like religion. So part of what Darwin had done in the 19th century was to really explain how change over long periods of time could lead to these changes in life forms. And Hoyle didn't like that something like a Big Bang smelled too much like religion. So you sort of have people from both sides thinking this doesn't. To me, it doesn't bother me at all. It's one piece of the puzzle, and that in many ways, I think the creation story from the Bible, that something from it, appears to be consistent with the evidence that doesn't bother me in terms of my own worldview. What I will say, when you talk about science not being able to distinguish or not being able, science can't say that this isn't a reasonable explanation, I'm just going to push back a little bit on that in the sense that what good science really does is a couple of different things. One is that so I'll take the example of when Einstein came up with his theory of general relativity. And this is a theory in which he explains how space and time behave around massive objects and how this explains something like gravity. So he basically took what Newton had told us about gravity and improved it in a way that was really quite significant. But when Einstein came up with those equations, he felt very certain that he was right, but he wasn't going to claim he was right until he had some evidence. And so he looked at something that had been a long-standing problem in astronomy, which was the exact orbit of Mercury around the sun. And it was just off in terms of Newton's laws, just enough that people knew there was a problem, that Newton's laws somehow didn't work exactly as they should. And Einstein did the calculations and said, my equations work perfectly with the Mercury orbit. So there you would have a kind of check and you'd say, okay, he's done, he did it. But he said, no, I need something where I'm not just going to confirm something that was an experiment that was already known. I need to make a prediction that can then be verified. And that to me is the part where I feel science can say something, because I have yet to hear a proposal that says, here's a prediction, if God exists, this will happen, and to follow that through with that to me would be evidence. And I would be thrilled, I'd be totally happy if that were the evidence that you show me. I'm not going to say there's no God, but I haven't seen even a proposal for what that would look like.
Well, I don't want to keep going back and forth and take over my part. Yeah, there's a group out in California named Reasons to Believe. An astrophysicist named Hugh Ross runs it. They sometimes have things more figured out than I do, so I don't know if I agree with everything they say. But they're in the process of coming up with just what's being talked about. What would be a testable hypothesis? What predictions would be made? And there's some, I think there are some things. I'll give you one example, and I said I'd mention a couple things about evolution. Here's one of them. This is very simple to understand. I'd predict that if God designed life and designed actual species, the further you get from the middle, the more fragile the species would become. That God designed them to be a species that was followed after their own kind, and that if you got away from the center, the species would become more fragile, because that's not the way God designed it. We see that, for example, with dogs. When dogs are bred, we've got Great Danes on one side, we have Chihuahuas on the other side. They would never survive in the wild because they're very, very fragile versions of dogs. But they survive because people take care of them. So that's a fairly unsophisticated hypothesis, but it's one I bring that up rather than some of my other ones, because that's a fairly easy one to understand. I would predict that as you get away from the center, species become fragile, and that's what happens.
Dr. Hughes, I want to go back to something you mentioned a few moments ago in passing. You mentioned the creation accounts, and from a Christian perspective, if Dr. DiSilvestro brought that into the conversation, it may not have jumped out quite as much, but could you dig into that a little bit more? And you referenced thinking about that perhaps as a historical record or a scientific record. How do you interpret some of the religious, and it doesn't have to be exclusively Christian, but from your vantage point, how do you interpret and read some of the creation narratives that might speak to some of the origin questions as well?
Well, I'm not, I'm utterly unsurprised that humans really for thousands of years have been wondering about, who are we? How did we get here? Where did all of this come from? These are questions that don't surprise me at all. But we do know that we as a species, anatomically modern humans, have been walking on this planet for over 200,000 years. And the evidence is absolutely indisputable. And that they would have, for most of that time, probably suffered greatly from, the kind of access to medicine we have today would not have been available to them, and that somehow, God would have cared about them, but not done anything until about 2,000 years ago. That to me is sort of inconsistent. What I also think is inconsistent is the notion, and I'm just going to go back to 100, I'm going to repeat myself, 100 billion galaxies, 100 billion stars in each of the galaxies. That's 1 followed by 22 zeros in terms of the number of stars in our universe. That is absolutely unimaginable. And that there isn't life elsewhere, to me, is also sort of unimaginable. They're so far away. We're not going to hear from them anytime soon. But that it's not out there, I'm absolutely convinced it is. On the other hand, what's hard for me to interpret is that you would have this almighty, all sort of knowing, all capable God that creates that kind of a universe, right? And then cares about our inner thoughts. That to me is incompatible. Those are that's part of just the grand scale, I think makes some of what Christianity in particular, but perhaps other religions as well, claim seems to me incompatible with the science.
Yeah, and I don't have a problem with the possibility there could be life on other planets. In terms of the Bible, just from a Christian perspective, it doesn't have anything to say about life on other planets. So it doesn't say there is, it doesn't say there isn't. But I would say, based on some of the properties of the anthropic principle, that if there is life on another planet, it's got to have to be set up really well, just like here. But I don't think, the Bible, I think, is silent on that. So as a Christian, I don't have an opinion on life on other planets. And also about medicine, I would just say that, how long humans have been on the earth, a lot of people have some different ideas, particularly based on mitochondrial DNA evidence. Some people say at least our branch of humanity may not be quite as old, or there may be branches before that. But we didn't have all the medicines, but on the other hand, we might not have had all the diseases either. We might not have had the proliferation of bacteria and microbes that we have now. To stop there.
So we're getting closer to the audience Q&A time, but before we shift and open the floor, are there any questions that you would want to ask your conversation partner before we open the floor for others?
I guess for me, the question is always, how do you go through, for example, the creation story and distinguish between parts where you would say, yes, this is the way it was, versus this is sort of a literary, account. That I think I always wonder about.
Yeah, and I think that's a very good question, and there's not an exact answer. It's really a little bit of a feel. Just how do you look through any literature and try to figure out what were they trying to say to the audience they were saying it to? which can be very challenging.
Any question for Dr. Hughes?
No, I've actually found a lot of what you're saying very interesting. I do agree with a lot of what you say. I come to some different conclusions, but I've appreciated a lot of the points you've made.
My final question for each of you, so give you a few moments to think about this. Do you think the world would be a better place if more people embraced your view?
Do you want me to begin?
That would be great.
All right. That's a hard question, but I'm going to bail out a tiny little bit in that as I said earlier, my goal is not to, change anyone's mind in here in terms of, oh, you should think the way I do. My goal really is more about you understanding the way I think, so that, if maybe at some moment in time we have I don't know, even the presidential candidate who says I'm an atheist, you are not, completely, opposed to even the idea of someone like that. So I think it comes down to what we do with our lives. And I think one can lead a beautiful, fulfilled, and meaningful life as an atheist. And in many ways, I feel fortunate to have a life that I feel is very much meaningful and fulfilling. And not just for myself, but also for what I give back to my community. But at the same time, I think that one can take, and we know of examples where people can lead, can have either worldview and do some pretty horrible things. And so I think at the end of the day, to me, it's more about how do you take the worldview that you have and do the best you can towards not just having a good life for yourself, but also contributing to making the world a better place. And that, I think, is more important than which, worldview you ascribe to.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'd just say if people follow the example of Jesus, I think the world would be a better place. We always see the headlines when there's, some priest that was a pedophile or some televangelist that ripped people off. But people sometimes say, well, that's what Christians are. But we don't get any headlines when someone's treated at a Catholic or a Methodist hospital. We don't get headlines every time World Vision feeds somebody around the world or sets up agriculture in some foreign country and helps people raise their own food. I've got two friends that both had graduate degrees in agriculture, could have made a lot of money, and instead they went to the Philippines to help them reshape their agricultural economy. We don't get any headlines when people do that. We only get the headlines when Christians do the wrong things. So I would say if people would truly follow the example of Jesus, that would help the world.
Thank you very much. I think you've established a civil way to embrace this. So I'll turn this over to Pastor Matt, and if you want to facilitate the audience time.
Sure thing. So, Richard,
I'd like to get us started.
All right, I guess I passed. So here's my question to both of you. Now, we humans have been creating stories from the beginning of time relative to our origins. We have religious myths, and we have scientific theories. My question is, we test these myths and these theories by the prophets in the Old Testament, and the effectiveness of a theology is whether it is effective in terms of predicting what is going to happen. In science, we create research, we anticipate what is going to happen, we have the hypothesis, we test that hypothesis. If it rejects the null hypothesis, we say, oh, our hypothesis must have something there. What I'm wondering is, since neither one of you has really demonstrated whether your particular approach would predict what is likely to happen, which do you think is likely to be more effective, or would you utilize both theology and science to facilitate our ability to predict, and then based upon the effectiveness of our prediction, we would assume that we have grasped reality.
I'll just say real quickly, from the theology standpoint, you get into human behavior, which gets pretty hard sometimes to judge what motivates, what causes things. So I'd say, there are things that have been tried along those lines, and some of them say it works, some say it doesn't, but some of that I think would be difficult. For example, there have been studies done, is prayer effective for people that are sick, or will the plants grow better if you pray for these plants or those plants? I've never been a big fan of those experiments, whether they show yay or nay for the question, because if there really is a God, he didn't sign the consent form to be in the study. So just praying, like that, I don't know that that's a real effective test of something like that, which would be theological. I think from the science side, as I said, I think there are certain things that we predict, and I think there are some things we could say that are testable. I'll mention one other one real quickly. One of my big problems with, again, the idea of evolution of species is this idea that mutation and natural selection can account for the diversity of species. One problem I have with that is that mutations and natural selection can't create new material. It just modifies what's there. In many cases, it breaks what's there, but temporarily confers an advantage. So I would like to see specific examples where mutations can actually create new information, new structures. Recently, I'll just conclude with this. Recently, Richard Dawkins, who's a big spokesman for the evolution side, they asked him, give me an example where a mutation created a whole new structure and didn't just modify something, or you got an increase in information, and he just sat there for like 10 seconds and finally said, that's a complicated question and it's not one we can address in this forum. So that's something I would think would be something I'd like to see testable.
So I'm not quite sure what you mean by predicting the future. I mean, there are plenty of things I can predict. If I throw a ball, in fact, I can mathematically predict exactly, if I know exactly how I threw it, I can predict exactly where it's going to land. And in fact, most of you would too. If I threw it towards you, most of you would actually know exactly how to, get it, because you've built up intuition about the world around us, and throwing a ball is something you've had experience with. What's absolutely fascinating about science is that the intuition that we have about the world it certainly helps us to get by on this planet, but it's not everything. And so many of the things that we think we understand actually aren't as we think they are. So, for example, I've been talking about space and time. They actually change under certain circumstances. They're not absolute. We could totally and completely disagree on how much time has passed, and both be right if, say, you were in a spaceship traveling by Earth near the speed of light and I was staying here on Earth. Or if you went near a black hole and I stayed here. What I can say, just another simple example, is we know the escape velocity from the Earth. So the velocity it takes and Newton calculated this, to get out of Earth's orbit is 11.4 kilometers per second. And we know that when we build a rocket ship that can go faster than that, that rocket ship's gonna go, right? And that's science. And so is the light in this room. So is the medicine that you take that cures your bacterial infection or whatever else. And without that, to me, you can't sort of pick and choose. I'm going to accept this science, but I'm not going to accept this other science. It's all part of one picture. In that sense, I do think that science actually can predict the future. It may not tell me, about my life in the future, but that's partly where I think some of why, people tend to turn to faith and religion comes from, because it actually can probably feel a little scary. I don't know what's going to happen. I can't tell you what's going to happen in 10 years.
Dr. Hughes and Dr. DiSilvestro have agreed to stay a few minutes after to continue. So in order to open the conversation, we're going to continue on with another question. So thank you for that. I think it's provoking the conversation, and there's always more to be said and further discussion. So we thank you for your generosity of your time as well. So.
Okay, this is a question for both of you. What was your background growing up on a religious perspective, and how do you feel that that shaped your opinion on the topics being discussed tonight?
That's a really interesting question. So I grew up in former Yugoslavia. I grew up in Serbia. I came to this country as a foreign exchange student when I was 17. So I grew up during the time that Yugoslavia was a socialist country. Religion was, my grandmothers were religious, but we were not. I did not grow up in a religious household. It's actually a very interesting, I think, sociological question, because most of Eastern Europe is now absolutely, most people are not just back to being religious, but being, very involved in their churches, having not done that for decades. So that's a topic for a whole other separate discussion. When I was 6, I grew up fairly modestly, but when I was 6, my mother and I, before New Year's Eve, so we didn't celebrate Christmas, we celebrated New Year's Eve, and we had Santa Claus, who was Grandpa Frost, and we had a tree that was a New Year's Eve tree, not a Christmas tree. So you get the picture. It was all really, the same stuff, just with different names. And my mother and I were in front of a department store, and I saw this beautiful doll that I absolutely loved, and I said, I wish Grandpa Frost would bring this to me. And so my mother actually bought it, as you can imagine, and we had company on New Year's Eve, and she rang the doorbell at midnight and left the doll outside on the doorstep, and she rang the doorbell at midnight and said, it's for you, go and see what, and I opened the door and I saw this doll, and it was gorgeous, and I should have been so happy, but I was not. I ran in and I said, I think Grandpa Frost left me this, but how did he know? And my mother said, well, he must have heard you. And I was like, how did he hear me? I was really, really upset. So I think I've had it in me to kind of be the, the spoiler from a young age. I just would not accept. I was unhappy about this. Again, I think, growing up in a certain way will definitely shape one's views. Whether or not one decides to change those views is a fascinating question. But in my case, I feel I've kind of just stayed on the same path.
Yeah, I was raised in a traditional church, and we were taught basically God grades on a curve. And so if you were, Hitler kind of pulled the curve, looked pretty good next to Hitler. Mother Teresa kind of pulled the curve up. And I figured, okay, I'm at least in the middle. I'll probably pass and get to heaven. But that was kind of what I was raised with, and that only a few special holy people really got to interact much with God in this life. So we should pray, and occasionally God might hear us, but that was somewhat the limit to relationship with God. When I got to college, I had people come and tell me, God does not grade on a curve. He wants you to get 100%, and if you don't do it, you fail. But the good news is that if you didn't get 100%, which none of us do, that Jesus came, God came in the form of a man. Jesus died and took our punishment in our place, and he establishes our relationship with God based on his sacrifice rather than how good I am. However, after that happens, we start developing a relationship with God that begins in this life and then would continue afterwards. So that was a radical difference for me to start thinking. However, about a year after that, I said, okay, I don't believe what I was raised with anymore, but why do I believe any of this? So I went through that crisis junior year of why should I believe in God at all? It was the early 70s, and it was the leftover revolution from the 60s where everybody questioned everything, so I was no different. And I said, well, why do I believe in anything? And to make a long story short, I looked at reasons to believe in God and felt, okay, I think I can believe in the God of the Bible. I'm about 90% sure based on reason, but there's still that 10% doubt, and I even talked about that tonight. I can't absolutely prove what I'm saying is true, but the faith came in, and as I said, it developed from reading the Gospels and seeing what Jesus was like, and I developed the faith, and then over time, God has done some subjective things in my life that I think have confirmed He's there.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I'm so nervous. Okay. This question's more for Dr. Hughes. You both brought up the Big Bang Theory, and as a Christian believer as myself, I pretty much know the answer of it, but if we evolved into what or who we are, is our main purpose on Earth just to survive?
That's a really great question. You shouldn't be nervous about asking it. Wow, that's a hard question. I think that we can find our own purpose. I don't know that the universe has a purpose or wants us to have a purpose, but I deeply believe in having a purpose in life. I deeply believe in our ability to be, really to be a social species. I mean, everything, if you kind of think about where we are, even just this, imagine the amount of cooperation that it takes, even just to build this, not just this auditorium, but this campus, to have people coming together to learn and to make their lives, as your school says, meaningful lives and productive careers. The amount of cooperation in our species is incredible, and I think that there are biological mechanisms in place that make that possible. I do believe that we find an incredible amount of purpose in being a part of each other's lives and being a part of each other's communities. I think that's partly why, you know, in some sense, no amount of evidence from science that dismisses some of the religious claims is going to be enough to convince people. It's just a wonderful way of being part of a community. I don't think we're here for a reason, but I think we can find our own reasons.
I think you know what I'm going to answer, so I'll let someone else ask a question.
Yep. Last question for the evening. No pressure.
And again, we'll stay around. If you didn't get to ask your question, hopefully I'll get a chance to talk to a few of you.
So I have a question for both of you. How do we now go apart, like hearing this discussion, how do we go back now and make this like useful? Because I think we've all had experiences with people either without faith or agnostic or other faiths who would, because I'm a Catholic, so they would, you know, yell at me for my beliefs, but I think we've also seen Christians who also do this too. Especially, I feel like this comes into the lack of education. So how do we take this into our personal lives and make this really fruitful and make this a good discussion that's equally like based on both sides? Do you want to start? I'm going to let you start this time.
Can you maybe narrow it down to just one specific, maybe a narrow question?
How do we build our community with people of different faiths and be able to express ourselves without upsetting others? So how do I talk to atheists in a respectful manner versus how do other people talk to Christians, or how do fellow Christians talk to Christians about being more inclusive?
Gotcha. I understand what you're saying now. Thank you. Well, it's easy to say this and a lot harder to do it. I liked what was said earlier about, you know, what was it? Something about, you know, conviction without, what was the word that was used? Civility, thank you. Yeah, I don't think it means not having convictions, and I'm a little concerned that we're getting in a society now where you are not allowed to have a conviction, or you're only allowed to have the one I have. That's not tolerance. So to me, it's okay to have convictions, but we can still be civil, and I think we have to listen to what the other person is saying. That's real easy for me to say and not do. So it's easier said than done, but I think if we talk to people, we actually have to listen to what they have to say and not just be ready to say, I can't wait till they stop so I can tell them why they're wrong.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think communication and conversation, and I think sometimes it's probably easier to first talk about other things. Like if you know you're going to disagree and have different worldviews, get to know the other person before you have the more difficult conversations. It's very easy to have something that's going to turn into an argument and then just give up, right? Because, yeah, you don't, but if you get close to someone and if you talk to someone and if you spend time with someone, it may be that that conversation can become a lot more meaningful. I have an example from my own class that I taught last semester, where two students, and I'm not even going to say what the faiths were, you might infer some information, but I'm just going to leave that kind of open. But they were basically from two different parts of the world that you would generally think are, people who might not get along. And these two guys in my class, I teach a small seminar of about 20 students. They sat together most weeks, and towards the end of the semester, when we went on a trip to the American Museum of Natural History, they walked around, the whole time, talking with one another. And when I had an event in my apartment for the class, they actually showed up at the same time they came together. And at one point, I wanted to really just take a picture of them and say, this is what education does to people. You talk about things bigger than yourself. You talk about things that are more than your differences, and it can become deeply meaningful. And then it's okay that we differ. We share so much in common, I feel often we just focus on the differences. And so start with what we have in common, and then time will come to talk about the differences. It will make it much more easier, I think.
Thank you.
Okay, and a big thank you to both Dr. Hughes and Dr. DiSilvestro.